My name is Carolyn Russell, and I'd like to thank you and welcome you, along with Bishop Bob Jackson, to Oakland, California. Domestic Violence Awareness Month gives us an opportunity to focus on domestic violence. Although domestic violence occurs throughout the year, we take this one month to recognize those who have lost their lives to domestic violence. We also want to reflect on the children who have lost parents to domestic violence. Today our program has been designed to support the work that we're doing at A Safe Place. We have national leaders and local faith leaders who will share strategies, interventions, and models that they are using within their own congregations. We will also share some of the testimonies from faith leaders and other people of faith who have experienced domestic violence and who can share with you some of what they have experienced. Typically, African American women go to their faith leader when they're in crisis. Many faith leaders supported victims, while many faith leaders have dismissed victims. And therefore, the focus of this project has been to engage our faith leaders within the African American community, to assist those who may need training, and to support those who are consistently preaching about domestic violence from the pulpit. We recognize that domestic violence within the African American community has not received the attention that it really should, and we thank Blue Shield of California for giving us this opportunity to engage in this work as we continue to educate our faith leaders and the community on how domestic violence and faith are critically important. We want to take this opportunity to encourage and support those who continue to educate everyone about domestic violence and the impact that it has on our families and on our communities. We want to thank everyone who has joined us today. We hope that you've become informed. We hope that you'll continue to support A Safe Place and use the resources that we've provided for you. Thank
you. Where do I begin? Because when we talk about domestic violence, we really need to think about, the word may be young. You know, it came out, in the early 70s, but the experience is very old, especially for African Americans. Historically, we came in this country as victims. And it has been passed on from generation to generation. And sometimes people don't understand that you can be around a whole bunch of people and still don't hear them cry. But when you can understand that when a woman tells you that something's wrong and you pay attention, know that what she's saying is true.
When women come and they are talking about their husbands, they are afraid. They're afraid to go home. They're afraid of it getting out. They're afraid of being battered. They're afraid of being ostracized. They're being afraid of being pushed out. But as an African American community, we deal with the same stuff. We cannot say anything. We have to be quiet.
The stigma and the shame has to be taken out of it because, well, what did you do? Well, she's not breaking the law by staying with him. He's breaking the law by hitting her. We re-victimize the victim. So we have to start talking about, do we even know what domestic violence really is? Are you unrapeable after you say, I do? Does that make you unrapeable in the church? I mean, the man who you married that was put there in position to cover you and your family, to cover your body, to respect it, is it really yours? Domestic violence is, you are groomed for that at a little bit at a time, and you think it's love. Oh, he's so, he's kind of jealous. Oh, I'm spending too much time at my mom's and, I got to be a better wife. I need to be home by a certain time because I used to be able to hang out, but now I'm married, so I got to get home. But, little by little, you don't really have to work. I'm going to take care of you. You don't have to go to school right away. Let's kind of get, and it's the little bit of your autonomy that's taken away. And before you know it, you're way back up in the corner. You're like, how did I get here? And you're isolated.
I have the opportunity to have so many people in clergy, specifically women, wives who have husbands that are pastors, that are bishops, that are ministers, that are deacons, that come and tell their stories about being called a bitch, as you will, or being beat down or being hospitalized and they didn't show up. And so he just said, well, she's home under the weather, but really she's recovering.
We have to bring people to a place where they can really be comfortable telling the truth about what's going on in their homes, not just to them, but to their children, because there's nothing pretty or nice or lovely about domestic or sexual violence. There just isn't. And so we have to be prepared to hear it, and we have to get past that shock and horror look on your face and make it so that the victim feels comfortable sharing their story with you.
And she says, well, I don't want to share anything because I don't want to mess up his reputation. Well, your mind is messed up and now your body is messed up and you kind of had a stroke a few times, but you don't want to mess up his reputation. And the children are angry because they see what's going on. And the other women in the church don't want her to tell on the pastor because, after all, he's our pastor. How could you do that to him? He's our bishop. We love him.
My own story, as I tell it most often, that I was a police officer in an abusive relationship with a police officer. And the main source that I looked up to deal with my issues, to be with me, were the two most powerful institutions that I was a part of. After all, I was part of the police department, had my own gang, had my own billy club, my own gun, my own mace, and a bunch of officers to protect me. Yet, when push came down to the shove, it was still the good old boy network. It was still the code of silence. The second was the church. Now, I had been in church all of my life, but one of the things that I remember is that there were no voices inside my head that gave me permission to be free, that gave me permission to move away and walk away from the violence. And this is why we need churches who are theologically sound, equipped with information to assist those who are abused, as well as hold the abusers accountable. To be equipped with information and first understanding that domestic violence is real. And the victims, survivors, and abusers are in our churches.
We had a lady that lovely member of the church, wonderful member, faithful, and her and her husband was having a lot of difficulty. He was a very jealous man, very insecure man, and she was kind of the brains of the family and the money of the family. And when she informed him that she wanted to separate from him, she hid, and he couldn't find her. But he knew one thing, that every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock, she was at Acts Full Gospel Church worshiping the Lord. So he came early one Sunday morning and waited for her, come in the parking lot, followed her in the parking lot, and killed her on our parking lot. He's in jail for life right now. She's dead. He's in jail. And it was a very sad day for Acts Full Gospel Church. So domestic violence is real.
Oftentimes, God will use prison in order to bring people to their purpose. God will use the prison experience. And I understand we all have our opinion about jailhouse experience. And so let me tell you something. If God has to use the jailhouse, let him use the jailhouse. When we deal with the inmates that we deal with, we talk about the whole part of transformation, accepting responsibility, and most of all, change. We start talking about the lack of skill of things they don't know. We start talking about all these stressors that build up as a result of these things, but let's not be confused that these stressors are just that. They're stressors, but they're not causes of domestic violence. We have to create a space for men to be able to address and talk about this.
Daddy was an alcoholic. Daddy started drinking. He passed over for a promotion. He was doing the mechanic work, but down south, at that time, you couldn't be black and have a supervisory position because you couldn't be in charge of whites. So he had a position of laborer. And so he would do the mechanical work, but he was a laborer. He'd get mad at work and come home and he'd drink, then come home at night and family catch hell because. And that's how they began to protect. But in order to protect myself, I got to control everybody in my world. And so when they get home, they might not be able to do so much on the job, but when they come home, that's where they express themselves in that way.
It's important to know that domestic violence is a learned behavior. We learn it in our culture, the music, the film, the television shows that we look at. And I love music, and I often think of the songs of my day when I was born. And I think of the music that we had and how it influenced me. Songs like What You Won't Do for Love. You try everything, but you just don't give up. That's what the women were hearing. What the men were hearing was, there must be 50 ways to leave your lover. Just jump on the bus, Gus. Make a new plan, Stan. Just drop off your keys and set yourself free. It's learned in our culture, but it's also learned in our church. And that's what I wanted to mention today, that our organizational structure, the way in which we decide what's good for men and what's good for women, the way in which in the African American church we use the Bible. And the ugly part about it is we know the history of slavery, and we know how the Bible was used against us. Slaves, obey your master. Stay in your place, be forgiven. And then we turn around in the church, in the black church, and we do the same thing to oppress women. And so we must begin to think about when we enter the doors of the sanctuary that we feel the absence of God because we've been told so much that there's no God for us by our abuser. And then we come to church and we hear the teaching and the preaching, and we see the way the church is organized and says, yeah, we're right. There is no God. And we do go into crises. We sit in the back of your church and we cry, but we have never seen. So we in the church must make a critical decision. Will we be a resource for victims of violence, or will we be a roadblock? Roadblocks are God hates divorce. Resources is God hates violence too. We all know about domestic violence when you're hitting and punching and threatening someone, but we don't know about the psychological abuse and the emotional abuse and the humiliation that women can experience that make them vulnerable to physical violence. And so we don't know, so we still ask the question, why don't she leave? Domestic violence is the only crime that I know of where the victim gets blamed for her victimization. And so although I use the term as for victims of domestic violence as women, I understand that men can be perpetrators of violence and they also can be victims of violence. I'm clear about that. I have 3 sons. Yet I am specifically talking about women today as victims because of the statistics and because of the world that we live in, the world of patriarchy, the world of sexism. And with African American women, we are triple jeopardy, race, class, and gender. And all of that makes us vulnerable to a specific kind of intimate partner relationship.
When a victim or survivor sits in my office and they're talking to me in the role of as a service provider, which is what I am in some capacities, and they're saying to me, he's calling me a bitch, he's calling me a whore. You're not hearing that as a faith leader. He called me some names, he hurt my feelings. See how that's different? There's the minimizing, there's the downplaying, there's the sanitizing because we're afraid to offend you. Well, get over it already. And so that's why the church, because that is the role and the responsibility of the church, not to have fundraisers, not to collect money, not to wear blue suits on Mother's Day and yellow suits on Women's Day and red suits on Men's Day, but to meet the needs of the people. And that's what we're trying to get back to.
When a victim of domestic violence comes into your church or already a member of your church, they can't hear a word that you're saying because all they're thinking about is when I go home, I'm going to be beaten. I'm not saying don't pray and that prayer don't work. I'm saying in addition to prayer, let's put some actions in.
Silence is no longer an option in the church. We have to understand that the number one thing is autonomy and safety, for your programming. And if you don't feel conditioned or educated enough to do it in your churches, start partnering with other organizations outside your churches.
And I think it's important as we talk about developing programming within our ministries that we understand that if you have been a victim on any level, that it's important to do your own work first. Because you know what? If you cannot get the oxygen mask on yourself first, you're not going to be able to help somebody else while your arms are flailing to get their oxygen mask on, right? And sometimes we are the wounded healers. Many of us come to this work through our own experiences. Many of us come to this work because it becomes the channel by which we heal.
My pastor said we should say no, and sometimes we should say hell no. And we should mean it. Because we should speak out against injustice. We should not be afraid to speak truth to power, to challenge principalities and systems. We should not be afraid. A woman who was experiencing domestic violence wrote this song years after she had recovered, that I leave with you on this day. There's a woman who is silent as the blows begin to fall. There's a child who is screaming as he's thrown against the wall. And it's someone you know. although we cannot know them all. And their voices are all around us if we only hear their call. There are none so blind among us than those who will not see. Our voices must be loud for those who cry out silently. When some of us are still enslaved, then none of us are free. The word has come from God, and it is calling you, and it's calling me. We are called to make justice, called to make it right, called to do the holy work of turning back the night, called to look into each shattered, shaking soul, called to make this world and our world whole.
I thought I knew a lot about domestic violence, and I learned so much about what I didn't know, and it was very informative, very educational for me, and it has really helped our ministry and helped the relationships at our church. So many people suffer in silence. Sometimes people don't want to share what's going on and a lot of things, and so there's some signs, there's some things that I learned to look for that are not obvious, so we can help more in the area of domestic violence. And thank you, and God bless you.